Welcome to Killer Women with your host, best-selling author Danielle Girard. And now, Danielle's next killer woman.
Hello, and welcome to Killer Women Podcast, a proud member of the Authors on the Air global network with more than 4 million listeners. I am your host, suspense author Danielle Girard, and my guest today is CJ Cooke. Carolyn is an award-winning poet and novelist published in 23 languages. She teaches creative writing at the University of Glasgow, where she also researches the impact of motherhood on women's writing and creative writing interventions for mental health. Welcome, Carolyn.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course, I'm so thrilled to have you. So before we get into all the fun themes and things you talk about in your writing, can you tell our listeners about A Haunting in the Arctic?
Certainly. A Haunting in the Arctic is a gothic ghost story that it has two different timelines. One is in the present day and is set in Iceland, and the 1901 narrative takes place in Dundee in Scotland. Well, we leave Dundee on a whaling ship and we set sail for Greenland.
Well, you mentioned in your acknowledgments that you're not obviously a historical boat expert. So there's an interesting start to this story. Tell us kind of how it came to be.
You mean the inspiration for the story or the start of the narrative?
The inspiration for the story.
Certainly. Well, there's a few origin points, I think, but I've been to Iceland before, and I was just really interested in writing about that kind of territory, and I explored kind of derelict buildings when I was a child. So was really interested in writing about kind of well, first of all, I was going to set this in a sort of derelict mansion, but it ended up being a shipwreck. I thought a shipwreck's just such a wonderful, there's so much story in a place like that or in a site like that. And I was really interested in getting the explorers and the contemporary narrative to kind of peel back the layers of history and all that story that remains within the shipwreck. So, and I was really interested as well in writing about the whaling industry, the way it was, but it's such a masculine kind of industry and narrative, and I really wanted to tell the story of a woman. This woman in my mind was on this ship, but I couldn't figure out why she was on this ship, especially with it being a whaling ship. And then it came to me what she was doing there, and I thought, oh God, that's right. Okay, I've got to write that.
Yes. So it's interesting too, because there's so much superstition that goes along with ships, and ships are oftentimes referred to as women, but as you said, it's a very sort of masculine industry. So there was a really nice sort of already conflict that started the story. So, you in your acknowledgments, you talk about how, memory and trauma are themes of many of your books. And I want to sort of dig into that because I did, obviously this story has a lot of roots in those two things as well. So tell us sort of why that resonates with you. What are you interested in sort of unpeeling as you write about those things?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting thing. I've just moved rooms because the other room, the storm is getting too loud.
Oh,
Sorry. Yeah,
from
we
your
have
background, you haven't moved at all. I was like,
I know
she's.
I have this is like a Zoom background, so yeah, it
I know,
doesn't
I love it. It's beautiful.
um yeah, I am really interested in telling women's stories, and it's interesting because I write standalone novels, but with each novel I have found so far that when I do research for that particular book, it kind of leads to something, another story that I'm interested in. So I go on to write. And I think in the course of writing the previous novels, The Lighthouse Witches, which looked at the Scottish witch trials, and then The Ghost Woods, which has been published in the UK already, but it's coming out in the US next year. And that
Okay.
book, that one looks at the history of mother and baby homes. And I think that the more kind of these stories that I tell, the more I realize that women have been written out of history, and I just feel compelled to write that story. I think a lot of the sort of heroes in my life have been women, but they're, the reasons for them being heroes have it's been sort of invisible. And I guess I'm just really interested in writing about those stories and those untold stories and those silenced stories.
Yeah, and this, I mean, this is a the woman on the ship is like you said, absolutely sort of a um, she's definitely a silent hero, right? I mean, her
Yeah.
family doesn't know she's on that boat, and um, you know, anyway, I'm not going to spoil it. You have to read it. It's so well done. So, let's talk about trauma, right? I mean, I think that you're somebody who's sort of in the mental health field, it sounds like but trauma is something that, that can bury itself so deep in us,
Yeah.
and then it sort of just sneaks up, and unless it's dealt with, it's always there, right? So what has led you down the path to sort of investigating trauma?
Um, so you're quite right. I work as an academic as well, and part of what I do is I teach creative writing at the University of Glasgow. My research looks at creative writing for trauma, because I think a long time ago I realized that what drives me to write, and I've been writing since I was a 7-year-old child, maybe even younger. Um, but I think what has always driven me to write is a way of processing trauma. Writing is this. I grew up in a really violent household, within a very violent social context, because I was growing up in Belfast during the Troubles in a very, very poor area where people were getting, thrown out of their houses for being the wrong religion, etc. Um, and I needed a way, I think, to process what was going on. And I really turned to writing, not just journaling, but actual creative writing. And I think there's a real power that comes with creating something and telling stories. And I suppose the more I've written into that space of trauma, the more I'm interested in recovery. And to me, without giving any spoilers, this is a story of someone who I wanted to tell a ghost story, but really to think about haunting in a
Hmm.
way that is about sort of psychological hauntings and things that stay with us. And to think about recovery as very, very non-linear. Uh, and this story to me there is a recovery, if you like, at the end of someone who has experienced trauma, but it takes a very, very long time for them to overcome it,
Hmm.
and I think I really have to be real in my writing, and I don't want to shy away from these things that trauma and trauma narratives are, as anyone knows who's experienced anything that has really impacted them negatively, you don't get over it quickly. And if even if it seems that you do, there's a relapse and there's a regression. And that recovery, I think, the honest kind of depiction of it is what interests me. And I love writing complex characters, and often those characters have lived through a lot. So that's what I
Yeah,
was really interested in
yeah.
writing this book.
Yes, the characters have lived through a lot. Well, and the power of, it's an interesting thing. We all have trauma, right?
Yeah.
Little T, big T trauma. And the idea of, journaling, of course, everyone recommends that, but it is interesting, and I hadn't really thought about it, that when you can write creatively, you sort of get to rewrite the story. You get to give people a reason for being
Yeah.
violent or angry, and you get
Yeah.
to sort of understand the trauma in a new way and perhaps let go of that.
Yeah. I through the course of my research, I found that there's this kind of um, thought process that, writing creatively is all about creating a product, whereas
Mm.
writing sort of expressively and journalistically is about the process. But I don't agree. I think that there's a real value in the process of writing creatively for trauma.
Yeah.
And it doesn't even have to be conscious that you sit down to write, oh, I'm going to process my trauma.
Yeah.
It all comes through. I think the self always shows up on the page. So when
Hmm.
you've gone through some stuff, it will come through in your writing, no matter what genre you're writing. And you're not sitting thinking about the product, you're thinking about, the process and the characters. And actually, in terms of the so-called product, I think it can be such a comforting thing to feel like you have made something of the material that you have. that you can maybe share, and maybe it'll be useful to someone. I think those are
Yeah.
enormously positive things. Writing is such an act of hope and courage.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm all for it. And if anything, I think writing creatively can protect you a little from sometimes being re-triggered by things that you've gone through.
Yeah, it's interesting. So for the first, I published 16 books. For the first time, I'm writing about something that happened to me. I'm just in the process of a divorce after finding out my husband had a very long affair. And it is interesting. I'm writing a book about a woman, in a long marriage. I've never brought my thriller life so close to my own home, and it is, or to my own heart, and it is a really interesting process. It's quite hard. It's much harder to bring something so close, I feel like, but it is also very powerful.
Yeah.
It's a really different experience for me, and it's interesting. There's a theme in the book that I love very much, sort of the push pull between, our sort of human desire to take revenge on somebody who has hurt us, and
Yeah.
therefore, though, stay in the trauma, right? When you cling to to the idea of making someone pay for something, you end up staying in the trauma. And then the opposite is, of course, the forgiving of someone, and then therefore letting go, which frees, both the person who you want to take revenge on, but also yourself.
Yeah.
And I feel like that is I want you to talk about that theme, because that is a huge theme in the book, and also a very sort of, I think, relevant theme for all of us in all the little ways we feel like we've been wronged, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so there's again, I don't think this is a spoiler, but there's a cage in this story, and that it was very much it was sort of an object when I was writing that came up, and I thought, oh, there's something about this. It's quite significant. Um, but it just seemed as well to represent the kind of way that this particular character was trapped and they couldn't move forward. And it is very much, as you say, about that impulse to seek revenge, but actually that impulse traps you within that moment. Um, excuse me, and doesn't allow that person to get past it. So yeah, I think yeah, this is a revenge story as well, as you say, but it's interesting how that is just a trapping, entombing kind of impulse.
Yeah, the cage, which is a brutal cage because it has spikes on the inside,
Yeah, yeah,
it's a very good metaphor for the idea that, we do damage to ourselves as
yeah,
well by holding on to these things that happen to us. There's also a lovely quote, that I tagged on page 330. Um, this is from the point of view of Nikki on the boat, and she's thinking of her daughter. She said, "Finally, my thoughts turned to Morag. Is that how you pronounce her name?"
yeah, yeah,
That's her daughter. "And it burns me, the guilt of it. How can I ever make it right? The effects of guilt are stronger than any haunting. It changed me over and over and over again," which I think is another really, the power of that guilt. And how do we let go similarly, right? How do we let go of
yeah.
our guilt over things that have happened to us in our lives, or things we feel responsible for?
Yeah, yeah. Again, the sense of her being changed by it, just the different sort of iterations that of a person that can come through guilt. Yeah, I was thinking about a lot of things that that really stop you growing as a person. And this is a quite a heavy book. But I felt as soon as I knew what the woman was doing in that boat, I just thought I have to go there. These are the things that she's experienced, and I think also in a way I'm maybe responding. There's a lot going on in the world right now that I thought, I don't know that I can write a happy book this time around, because well, none of my books are happy, but I just thought I thought, the darkness here is coming from a place of just shock, and I'm processing a lot of what's going on right now in our on our planet. So
Exactly. Well, and I don't think it's a dark book. I mean, I think I can imagine, this is my first CJ Cooke book, but I can imagine that you are a dark writer, but I don't think it's pessimistic. I think there's optimism,
yeah,
throughout, and I think it really is about sort of looking at yourself and deciding sort of what you're hanging on to and what you're able to let go of, and then how you work through that. And
Yeah.
with that, there's also sort of the theme of motherhood in the book.
Yeah.
Not just, actual mothers and children, although obviously Nikki has a daughter, whom she's lost, which we learn pretty soon in the book. But also people that become sort of surrogate mothers, right?
Yeah.
Like she does on the boat for, one of the young men. So that's another thing that is an interesting theme for you, and I think probably comes naturally. I'm assuming you are a mother.
Yeah.
That sort of
Yeah.
but I think that's another thing to explore, and it's a, that is a natural source of some very heavy emotions within us, right? The idea that you
Yeah.
have brought this baby. So did the sort of extension of your writing and your research about motherhood come from, becoming a mother, and tell us sort of a little bit more about that, because I think that's fascinating as
Yeah.
well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think also I think becoming a mother, I've always been a feminist, but when I became a mom, I thought, wow, the world really it seems different. I'm viewed differently as a mother. I sensed a
Mhm.
shift in not just it wasn't a psychological shift really, it was more the institution of motherhood and what I was now part of. I thought, wow, this is quite I feel like I've time traveled to a distant point in the past.
Yeah.
Um, I still get this, just, I even as a writer, I remember, people would say, "Oh, you're a mother. How do you juggle your writing with your work or with your children?" Sorry. My husband never gets asked those questions.
I
He's
know.
like,
I
"What?
know, right?
What is this?"
Exactly.
It's bizarre, and just so many moments, as a mother confronting the sort of institution of motherhood and thinking, God, we really need to look at this because it doesn't seem that we have moved on very much. Um, so I think all of that has very much fueled my writing, both in terms of my relationship with my children, but the institution of motherhood and how that functions in society and how I feel about it. I think, there's a terrible lot of silence, a lot of things that I didn't know and wonder why we don't know more about it, why we haven't talked about it.
Yeah.
I think it's not the answer is not a small one, it's massive. And, even in recent years, as I've been approaching perimenopause and I've been thinking,
All the
why
fun stuff. Yeah.
yeah, but why have I not why is this not talked about? Like
Yes.
motherhood, menopause, these things are not new. So why are they not like more prevalent? And we are getting, of course, we are getting more women's stories and we are talking more about motherhood and menopause. But still, God, when I
Mhm.
became a mother 17 years ago, man, it was a whole new planet.
Right, right.
Really,
And
yeah, it just made me very much a feminist. If I was a feminist before, it made me even more strong about it because I thought there's a reason that we don't know more about this. So
yes, yes. I think that the thing about it, is the idea that I know, of course, I believe, I should say, that some of the way that the motherhood is treated is, of course, a symptom of the patriarch, right? The men are in charge in many powerful, most powerful positions are occupied by, basically white men, right? I mean, that's sort
yeah,
of the structure of the world, um, and and certainly men themselves, but there's also this idea that's interesting is that, and I is that I also was like, I had the idea that I would always have a career. I would always, do XYZ because I was, a strong woman and I wanted that. But motherhood also shifts I think for us, right? It
yeah,
takes all of a sudden you have something that is more valuable. I
yeah,
mean, really, literally, like you would do anything for this thing that no longer lives inside your body, which is
yeah,
terrifying. And I
yeah,
don't know if that society puts that on us. Like, is that are we, because we're the women, we're the mothers? It is,
yeah.
is that put on us to be the ones who are sort of feel more and are more responsible and take the primary parenting role, or is that something that develops in us because we grow them, or because we're biologically more nurturing, or so that's kind of an interesting push pull too.
Well, I think, yeah, of course, those instincts and those impulses are there, and all the time, and of course, but women's work has been so devalued that we just don't have a say in the matter. That,
Mhm.
as in the US, for instance, because I remember when I was to take maternity leave, and one of my jobs was only 4 weeks full pay, but then I learned in the US that there's no maternity leave, and I was
No.
like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Surely that's going to make a lot of women just leave their careers, leave their
Yeah.
job, which it
Yeah.
does.
It
Um,
does.
and it's beyond me, but yeah, we just don't really get a say. I think we end up doing the double or triple shift. And we have to develop these sort of superhuman capabilities, but at great cost to
Yeah.
ourselves. Um, but I think that fundamentally women's work, including writing, has traditionally been seen as invisible, unpaid. We do it for the love of it, etc. And really, if the shoe was on the other foot, I think if it was the men giving birth and the men with those maternal instincts, I think the world would be completely different. So
Mhm.
it's
It is, yeah, it is interesting, and I think you're absolutely right. And for some reason, w we end up going along with it, and maybe it is something that sort of is internalized, right?
yeah,
That motherhood is, that it is sort of, not valued, and so therefore, you have to sort of say you do it for the love of it, because otherwise, there's no way to sort of justify what we're doing, right? How we're
I think
spending our time.
we're also exhausted. We're all
Yeah,
so exhausted that you're just trying to, keep your head above water at certain points of parenting.
yeah.
But it is exhausting trying to juggle it all and trying to tackle a patriarchy. I have three daughters, um, and they laugh because I'm like, just don't have children, like, and I'm referring to the institution. They know that. Like,
Yeah,
I adore my children, and I have a son as well. But I'm just like, the institution of motherhood is really tough on women, and
yeah,
I don't think it's fair, and I don't think it's moved on enough. So I want you,
yeah.
you know, just live your
I think,
life and don't feel you have to have kids or adhere to any kind of gender roles.
yeah. I know. I think this generation of young women. My daughter's 24, and I have a younger son, but I think she thinks a lot about whether or not she wants. She certainly doesn't want the kind of, you
Yeah,
know, motherhood experience that I had, where the bulk of it did definitely fall on me, and
yeah,
if I needed coverage, I had to ask for it. Versus if my husband needed coverage, he just went
yeah,
off and did whatever he wanted to do. So, and at the time, you justify it by being like, well, he has the sort of the more professional job, and he's but it really is just an excuse we make for ourselves to, you
it
know,
is.
are they that they make for themselves that we accept. So it
Yeah,
isn't,
yeah,
it
yeah.
isn't valued. Yeah.
It's for real. Like, I was always the breadwinner in our marriage. I was the one with the professional job, and yet I still. My husband's really great, I should say. Like, he is really great in that he's, like, no, 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 you go do your thing. It's me though, feeling, oh no, but I can't, I can't do it, and and I make life hard for myself a lot of the time because it is internalized. So
Yeah. It's that guilt. It's the guilt thing, but
yeah,
it's internalized, but it's also taught, right? I mean, it's like this
yeah,
famous sort of Oprah show about the stay-at-home moms versus the working moms, and this
yeah.
incredible animosity where what we really should be doing is saying, if that's what works for you,
Yeah.
that's awesome. This is
Yeah.
what works for me. It's different than that. But instead, and that is, I think that animosity is fostered by the patriarch, right? We're
Oh,
taught
oh, it
to
is.
fight. There's only
Yeah,
one way to do it, you
yeah,
know.
absolutely. I mean, I finished my PhD when I was in my mid-20s and then had an academic post, and then I had kids. But the guilt that I had about going back to work, about continuing to work when some of my friends were stay-at-home moms, I was like, I really felt like just terrible. And my mom had been a stay-at-home mom, my grandmother had been a stay-at-home mom, my mother-in-law had done the same. And I just felt like I was this, I was damaging my children, which is, a total lie. I wasn't. And
Right.
they're all healthy and happy and everyone's fine. But at the time,
Yes, and
I,
you
I
empowered them probably. I mean, that's the reality, is that by taking care of yourself in some little way, which we can argue a career is or is not, depending on sort of why. But
Yeah.
but you're actually teaching them that it's okay to put yourself. There's this idea that selfishness is bad, particularly in women, right? We're not
Yeah.
supposed to be selfish, and
No.
yet it's what feeds us, right? We don't have those things that are for ourselves. Then
Yeah.
what are we, what do we have to show our children for sort of what we've done? And I'm not saying that stay-at-home moms aren't
Yeah.
incredibly valuable, but if you're a mother who really has nothing of her own, then I think first of all, I think that's brutal. That
Yeah.
is, that is so hard. And secondly, I don't know that that teaches our children, particularly our girl children, but also our boy children. I don't think
Yeah.
it necessarily teaches everybody what it is to sort of have something that matters to you.
I know. I think, those early days of motherhood, certainly I know that I struggled a lot with guilt and a lot of,
Ah,
what am I doing to my children that's going to affect them forever?
me
Right
too,
down
right.
even to breastfeeding, the guilt that I had.
Ah,
I wasn't ever able to breastfeed for the maximum was 8 weeks. There was always some terrible complication. It was terrible. But
yeah,
and I really beat myself up. Even now, it's a sore, like sensitive thing.
yeah,
I can't get past it, even though rationally, I'll
right,
say to anyone, you do not need to breastfeed. Just do what is
right,
the fed baby. It doesn't matter. But,
right.
I still have this
Hmm.
thing that, oh, I did not breastfeed for a year. So
Oh, I know. And that isn't, I mean, I remember that even from the medical professionals when I gave birth to my daughter, just the, absolute focus on this is the only way, your baby gets what he or she needs. And it is, I mean, of course, breastfeeding is great if you can do it. It's just like
yeah,
eating organic or
yeah.
not cutting out sugar, but it's not realistic for every person in every situation. And lots of women I know, for instance, couldn't breastfeed at all. Like
No,
they just
I know,
couldn't,
same.
or a baby wouldn't latch. And then you spend all this time, and then a child gets a cold and you think, well, that's because I didn't breastfeed. I
Right?
mean,
Yes, yes,
that's
yes,
the, and
exactly.
these are the stories we tell ourselves that make us, that just feels, there's such a heavy burden for us to carry. And we
Oh, yeah,
don't talk about it because there's, like you said, there's so much shame. Well, I
there
couldn't
is.
do this, or I mean, my dad was an OBGYN. He's passed away now. But I was the first to have a baby. I'm the oldest. And he said the whole time, my doctor was his partner, but he said the whole time, we're not inducing you, no matter what, because you're not going to have a cesarean section. You're going to have a vaginal birth, blah, blah, blah. This was like that was the thing you had to strive for. So what happened? Of course, I had a C-section, a cesarean, because I never would have dilated. I would have died. And, I would have been one of those women who died in childbirth. And yet, it
I
became
know.
such a source of shame for me
Oh,
that
I
I had
know.
to have a cesarean section. And then, I had two cesarean sections. And then my sister had a cesarean section. Then we were just like, it was Murphy's Law. He just put that on us. We
Yeah,
thought, oh, we can't, we have to do it this way. And it
yeah,
was literally something I still feel sensitive about, that
yeah,
there's
right.
some experience of going through the birth canal that would have made my children,
I know.
happier, healthier adults.
Well, honestly, a friend of mine, she breastfed her children for like 2 years each. And I always thought, oh, that's so beautiful and wonderful. I wish I could have done that. But she had cesareans and she had the same thing that she felt like she wished she could have had my sort of birth. And I was like, I think I would have, now that I know my pelvic floor is wrecked, I think
I
I should
know.
have just had cesareans because if I'd known how much it wrecks your pelvic floor. So
I
yeah,
mean,
who
it's
knows?
true. And then that's another thing I think that you think about, like being in a car accident, or falling down a set of stairs and hurting your knee, and we do, there's all this physical therapy that comes. But when you
Yes.
have a baby, which is an incredible process on your body, nobody
Yep.
talks about how to, like, strengthen the muscles that got weakened, or bring the stomach muscles back together. I mean,
Nope.
that is stuff we just don't even touch. And it's just
Nope.
now people are starting to discuss the fact that, wow, there's a lot that goes on in a woman's body during pregnancy,
Yeah.
and maybe we should look at how she recovers. I mean,
Yeah, you think?
right? I mean, it is really, to your point, it is really interesting. And I love the fact that you deal with some very hard women issues in this, in this book. And it sounds like in all your stories, because I do think, like you said, and feminist has a, I'm a feminist, it has sort of a little bit of a sort of spiky meaning for people. Like they get, it's not that we're saying we're anti-men. I don't think we're saying that. I mean, I have a son I love. I have brothers, and even my ex-husband. These are wonderful men in many ways, but I do
Yeah.
think there's people standing up for them all the time. Nobody is standing up, right? Not as many people are standing up for us.
No,
Um,
absolutely. That's all it is. Like, you're right, because even like you give birth and then someone literally, I was home with some of my kids. Well, one of them was born at home, but sometimes I was home from the hospital within like 8 hours. And then someone hands you a baby, take care of this baby now that you've just given birth. Yeah. So when I had my first child, so I'd moved to England quite recently. I didn't have any of my family around, just my husband. And so I came home, I was sent home from hospital 24 hours after she was born. And my mother-in-law, who was married to my father-in-law, she was from Azerbaijan, and she could not believe that I was home expected to care for this baby, do everything, because in her culture, you stay in bed for 40 days after you give birth, and all the women take care of everything else. They make the meals, they bring you food, they look after any other children that you have, they clean the house, and they bring the baby to you.
ah,
Take the baby
that's
away, and you
heaven.
sleep, and you recover, and
Yes.
the baby gets nourished. And I thought, yeah, that would be nice.
That sounds ideal.
Oh
Exactly.
yeah,
And it's not, the other thing I think is so interesting is the idea of like, and I don't know how it works over there, but here, when you take this, there's like they offer these birthing classes, right? It's like 12
yeah,
weeks or something.
yeah,
You go once a week for an hour, and it's all about labor, right?
yeah,
So for me, of course, it was in the end, I think there's 1 hour at the end, or maybe a little less, about breastfeeding. The rest
yeah,
of it is about the labor and how you're going to get through labor. And
yeah.
yet, of course, I ended up having two cesarean sections. And I thought, where's the course that tells me how to survive once that baby's born,
That's right.
until I get the hang of how to, what her cries mean, and being
Yeah,
sleep deprived. And it is such an isolating experience. It is
it really,
so, and yet, at least in this country, it sounds like your mother-in-law's country that sounds perfect. But in this country, and I think in a lot of, you know, European countries
yeah,
as well, we have not figured out how to
no,
support women in those early stages. And it's the precursor of so many issues for children growing up, right? I mean,
yeah,
the
yeah, no,
stress of it is,
it's terrible. I mean, yeah, I completely agree. Looking back, and this is what motivates me to say to my daughters, just don't have kids, right? Because they want it. Like one of my daughters,
yes,
she wants to adopt, so they know the spirit. Like we have really great banter. But one of my daughters, she wants to adopt, and I'm like, I will be there. I will be on hand. I will give you all
yeah,
the support you need, because I didn't get that. And
yeah,
looking back, I do not know how I got through that. But I know I'm not the only woman. So many women are in these really isolating. I mean, my husband had to go back to work. He had a week off maternity
yeah,
leave, and then he had to go back to work. And I remember thinking, oh my God, what do I do? I've got
yeah.
this.
I was like, don't leave me alone with this baby.
Yes,
I just cried and cried because I was so
same,
overwhelmed.
same. Yeah,
And yeah, I mean, it's just a very, I mean, I think it's a really isolating thing we don't really talk about. And how I mean, it's funny that it's such a wonderful thing. And like you said, you adore your children, I adore my children, but it's
yeah,
also trauma. That's a traumatic experience to have
it is.
a child, and imagine that they look so fragile, although they're
Yeah,
much hardier than they look. But it is a
yeah,
really isolating and terrifying experience. And I think it's just so important for us to talk about it. And I really appreciated, the way that you did. And I also think it's interesting, like for instance, in the way that um, Nikki's husband, Alan, deals with the loss of the baby so differently, right? It's her guilt. She's
yeah,
the one that seems to have the guilt about it, even though really, they were both, I mean, they're both traumatized, of course, but
yeah.
it is just it's a different onus put on her as the mother.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I think there very much is. And I still see that. Like even in schools, there's been a few times where we've had meetings. Two of my children are autistic, and my husband's got along for a meeting, and then there's been a form that he has to sign, and they're like, oh no, we'll get your wife to sign this. And he's like, but what? Why does
Right, right,
the mother have to sign it? Like, who said? It's
right.
crazy.
Isn't that it is. It's really it is a very there's just a lot of things we need to sort of explore and
Yeah.
change because it is not the system doesn't work. It doesn't work for anybody. If it doesn't work for the mothers, then it doesn't work for the children,
No,
right?
and it doesn't work for the fathers. Like, there's such an imbalance, and it does no one any good. I think we
Mm-mm.
need to get that right. But
Yeah.
I think we're slowly inching forward. But
Yeah,
sometimes I worry
okay.
we're sliding backwards. But yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I know there's certainly things that have changed in my experience as a mother, from when my mom was a mother
of
that
course.
are good. So
Yeah.
I'm positive
We're inching along.
inching along.
Um
Yeah,
inching or maybe a little less than inching, centimetering along.
just a bit of
Um, well,
plateauing.
this was so fun, Carolyn, to talk about. I really appreciate, and there is, um, the sort of super, there's some supernatural, or it's hard to argue if it's in her head, right? I mean, there's some really powerful stuff that happens, and the boat, and we didn't talk about the boat, the fact that the boat, this old whaling boat, ends up in Iceland, and then there's a new cast of characters that go to
Yeah,
visit it before it's sort of permanently sunk. In the
yeah,
really in the dead of winter, it's you do a very beautiful job of the sort of desolation of that um, environment, and how that can make people, the dark and the cold, and
yeah,
how it can make people feel a little insane, which I thought was super powerful. So
yeah.
um I enjoyed it so much.
Oh, I'm so pleased to hear that. That's good. I wanted to create that sort of atmosphere, and I wanted to, I love stories that transport me, and I wanted to create a sense of, being in that remote part of Iceland, which I traveled to actually, to do research. But it was really great to see that and to imagine it in the depths of
Yeah,
winter when it's
yeah.
full on dangerous.
I was gonna say, I hope you didn't go in the depths of winter because that did not look super pleasant.
No, Iceland is full on dangerous, like in winter, and even when there's no volcano. But I mean, because my husband came with me, and we went in June, but we still had to hire a, pretty souped up 4x4, and the road was just a gravel track for 60 kilometers
Oh
off
my
the
God.
side of a mountain, like any kind of wrong turns, and we would have been down in the ditch. So it was
Yeah,
but it's fabulous. Iceland's wonderful, and it's got so much history to it as well. So yeah, I wanted to make sure that I researched that and spoke to it appropriately. And then the history
yeah.
of whaling as well. I wanted to create that feeling of being on the ship when it was a whaling.
Yes, which you did. I thought beautifully, and what a hard existence that would be as well. So,
Yeah, yeah.
um, anyway, it was super fun, and really a very powerful read. So,
Thank
thank you
you.
for joining us today, everybody. This was Killer Women with CJ Cooke, and I'm sure she has. This is not her first novel, so there's lots of fun things to read. But A Haunting in the Arctic is her latest and fabulous book. Thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, everybody. Bye bye.